An arrogant millionaire's mistreatment of his manservant leads to his wife stepping in, but her shocking secret threatens to destroy their family. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The imposing Whitman Mansion stands as a testament to wealth on New York's Upper East Side, its marble facade gleaming in the morning light. Inside, David Johnson moves methodically through the grand foyer, his shoulders tense as he polishes the already immaculate brass fixtures. Charles Whitman's footsteps echo through the hall, each click of his expensive shoes making David's movements more rigid. "Johnson, you missed a spot." Charles's voice cuts through the silence, though both men know there isn't a speck of dust in sight. "Do it again. All of it." Charles pauses, checking his gold watch with exaggerated care. "And this time, try to make it worth the money I waste on your salary." David's hand tightens on the polishing cloth, but his face remains neutral. He's learned over 3 years of employment that showing any reaction only makes things worse. The mansion's pristine condition is his responsibility, a fact Charles never fails to lord over him with thinly veiled contempt. From the grand staircase, Emily Whitman watches the interaction, her manicured fingers gripping the banister. Her husband's casual cruelty has become more pronounced lately, and the weight of her silence feels heavier with each passing day. She remembers last Christmas when David had fallen ill, and she brought him soup, defying Charles's order to let him deal with it himself. The gratitude in David's eyes had struck something deep within her, a recognition of shared humanity that Charles seemed incapable of understanding. The kitchen becomes David's sanctuary as the day progresses. Here, among the gleaming professional-grade appliances, he finds moments of peace. His hands move with practiced precision as he prepares the evening's dinner, chopping vegetables with the skill of a trained chef. The knife's rhythmic sound against the cutting board serves as a temporary distraction from his reality. While working, David allows himself to imagine his own restaurant. He envisions a warm, welcoming space where his creativity could flourish, where he wouldn't have to endure sideways glances or barely concealed sneers. He's been saving carefully, tucking away small amounts from his salary, but the dream feels distant under Charles's oppressive presence. Emily drifts into the kitchen, drawn by the aromas of David's cooking. She notices how he straightens immediately, professionalism masking the easy confidence he displays when alone. "That smells wonderful, David," she offers, trying to inject warmth into the sterile atmosphere Charles insists upon. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitman," David responds, his tone carefully measured. He continues preparing the meal, but his movements become more guarded, aware of the precarious nature of any interaction with the lady of the house. The dynamics in the mansion operate like a carefully choreographed dance, with Charles leading through force of will and wealth. David maintains his role perfectly, efficient, invisible when desired, present when needed. But beneath the surface, tensions simmer. Emily's growing awareness of her husband's behavior creates ripples in their carefully maintained social facade. As evening approaches, David sets the dining room table with practiced precision. Each piece of silverware reflects the chandelier's light, each plate aligned with mathematical accuracy. Charles will inspect it all, looking for any excuse to criticize, to remind David of his place in the household hierarchy. Emily observes David's meticulous work from the doorway, noting the care he takes with every detail. She sees beyond the servant role Charles forces upon him, recognizing the dignity and strength it takes to endure such daily degradation. The weight of complicity in her husband's behavior sits heavily on her conscience, but she remains uncertain how to challenge the status quo without making David's situation worse. The Whitman Mansion buzzes with activity as New York's elite gather for Charles's annual business dinner. Crystal glasses clink, practiced laughs echo through marble halls, and David moves efficiently between guests, serving champagne with practiced precision. The evening progresses smoothly until Charles's voice rises above the polite murmur of conversation. "Johnson," Charles calls out, his tone carrying the sharp edge of anticipated cruelty. "Show our guests how you arrange the hors d'oeuvres. Apparently, my wife thinks you have some sort of special talent." His words drip with condescension as he gestures toward the serving table. David approaches, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the flush creeping up his neck. The room grows quieter as guests tune into the developing scene, their conversations dropping to whispers. "You see," Charles continues, lifting a perfectly arranged plate. "Johnson here thinks he's quite the chef, believes he could run his own business someday." A few uncomfortable chuckles ripple through the crowd. "Tell them, Johnson, about your grand plans for a catering company." Emily stands frozen near the fireplace, her champagne glass trembling slightly. She watches David's face remain carefully blank, years of practice helping him maintain composure under Charles's scrutiny. "I simply ensure the food meets Mr. Whitman's standards," David responds quietly, his dignity intact despite Charles's attempt to humiliate him. "Standards?" Charles laughs, the sound harsh and deliberate. "Let's be clear about standards. In this house, you serve food. You don't create it. You're the help, Johnson. Know your place." He emphasizes each word, his gaze challenging anyone to object. The silence in the room becomes oppressive. Several guests suddenly find their shoes fascinating, while others pretend to be absorbed in their drinks. Emily feels her chest tighten with each passing second. After the guests depart, Emily finds Charles in his study. The confrontation she's avoided for years can no longer wait. "What you did tonight was cruel," she states, her voice stronger than she feels. Charles barely looks up from his laptop. "Don't be dramatic, Emily. Johnson needs to understand his position. Your misplaced sympathy only encourages delusions." "Delusions?" Emily moves closer to his desk. "The only delusion is believing you have the right to treat another human being that way. David is more than capable." "David?" Charles cuts her off, finally meeting her gaze. "Since when do you call the help by their first names?" His eyes narrow. "This bleeding heart routine is becoming tiresome, Emily. Remember your position in this household as well." The threat in his voice is clear, but Emily stands her ground. "Our position doesn't give us the right to destroy someone's dignity." "Dignity?" Charles laughs coldly. "I pay him well enough. That's all the dignity he needs." Meanwhile, David sits in his small room above the garage, the evening's humiliation replaying in his mind. The walls feel closer tonight, the space more confining than ever. He removes a worn notebook from beneath his mattress, opening it to reveal carefully calculated savings figures and business plans. The columns of numbers represent more than money. They're his escape route, his chance at independence. But tonight's events have shaken his confidence. Charles's words echo in his head, mixing with similar voices from his past, all telling him to stay in his place. Through the window, David can see the light in Charles's study, where the voices of Emily and Charles rise and fall in heated discussion. He's witnessed enough of these arguments to know they're about him, about the growing divide between the Whitmans' views on how he should be treated. Emily's defense of him, while appreciated, complicates his position. Her kindness makes his daily interactions with Charles more bearable, but it also puts her in a difficult position with her husband. David knows he needs to make changes, but the path forward seems increasingly complex. The evening ends with three people lying awake in the same house, each trapped in their own way by the roles they play. Charles, convinced of his right to maintain control. Emily, struggling with her complicity in a system she's beginning to question. And David, realizing that dreams require more than just money. They require the courage to break free from the shadows of other people's expectations. The morning after the disastrous dinner party, Emily finds David in the conservatory, tending to her prized orchids. She notices how his shoulders tense at her approach, a learned response to any member of the household entering his space. The glass walls create an illusion of openness, but the air feels thick with unspoken words. "David," Emily begins, her voice soft but steady. "About last night, I want you to know that Charles's behavior was unacceptable." She moves closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance. David's hands pause over the plants. "Mrs. Whitman, please." "You don't need to." "I do," she interrupts. "And please, when we're alone, call me Emily." She watches his reaction, seeing the internal struggle play across his features. I've noticed how you care for these orchids. They've never bloomed so beautifully before you came." The simple observation breaks something in the formal atmosphere. David's posture relaxes slightly as he looks at the flowers. "My grandmother taught me about orchids. She said they're like people. They need the right conditions to thrive." Emily sits on a nearby bench, creating a moment that feels almost normal, almost equal. "Tell me about your catering dreams," she says. The real version, not the one Charles tries to dismiss. David hesitates, years of conditioning making him wary. But Emily's genuine interest and the privacy of the conservatory give him courage. He describes his vision, a high-end catering service specializing in fusion cuisine, combining his classical training with his family's traditional recipes. His voice gains confidence as he explains his business plan, the market research he's done, the savings he's accumulated. "I have about 60% of what I need for startup costs," he admits. But it's not just about the money. In this industry, connections matter. References. And with my current position, he trails off, the implications clear. Emily listens intently, seeing not the servant Charles demeans, but a capable businessman held back by circumstances and prejudice. "You've thought this through carefully," she observes. "How can I help?" The question hangs in the air, dangerous in its possibilities. Before David can respond, Charles's voice echoes from the mansion. Both Emily and David instinctively step apart, their moment of connection shattered. Charles appears in the conservatory doorway, his eyes taking in the scene with calculated suspicion. "Emily, darling, what are you doing out here?" "Johnson, surely you have more important tasks than chatting about flowers." "I was just instructing David about specific care for the new orchid specimens." Emily lies smoothly, years of navigating Charles's moods evident in her casual tone. Charles's attention focuses on David with predatory intensity. "Indeed? Well, Johnson, since you're such an expert on everything from cooking to flowers, perhaps you'd like to add Gardner to your list of failed ambitions?" David maintains his professional mask. "Excuse me, sir. I'll return to my regular duties." He exits quickly, leaving Emily to deal with her husband's growing suspicion. Over the next few weeks, Charles's controlling behavior intensifies. He creates additional tasks to keep David busy, implements stricter scheduling, and shows up unexpectedly in areas where Emily and David might interact. His possessiveness extends beyond mere ownership of property. He seems determined to own every moment, every interaction within his domain. Despite Charles's increased vigilance, Emily finds ways to support David. She leaves business magazines in the kitchen, casually mentions catering contacts within her social circle when David is nearby, and ensures he overhears conversations about upcoming events needing catering services. David absorbs this information while maintaining his careful professional distance. But something has shifted in the household's dynamic. The simple act of being seen, truly seen, by Emily has strengthened his resolve. He begins documenting his recipes more carefully, photographing his presentations, and building a portfolio in secret. Late one evening, as David prepares to leave the kitchen, he finds a business card on his workstation. It belongs to a successful restaurant owner known for mentoring new talent. On the back, in Emily's elegant handwriting, "Your dreams matter. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The moment represents a turning point, a silent acknowledgement that changes are coming, whether Charles approves or not. The power dynamics in the mansion have begun to shift, creating hairline fractures in Charles's carefully constructed world of control. The summer heat presses against the mansion windows as Emily paces her private sitting room. The space, decorated to Charles's exacting specifications, suddenly feels suffocating. Every crystal vase, every carefully curated piece of art represents her husband's control over her environment. She catches her reflection in an ornate mirror and barely recognizes the perfectly coiffed woman staring back. Meanwhile, David works methodically in the kitchen, converting his workspace into a test kitchen after hours. He's begun purchasing small pieces of equipment with his savings. Nothing obvious enough to draw Charles's attention, but essential items for his future business. A professional knife set hides in his quarters, specialty pans are stored in rarely used cabinets, and his recipe testing occurs late at night when the household sleeps. Tonight, he's perfecting a fusion dish that combines French techniques with soul food influences. The familiar motions of cooking center him, each precise cut and measured ingredient bringing him closer to his goal. A notebook beside him contains detailed cost analyses, portion calculations, and potential menu combinations. A sudden noise makes him freeze. Emily appears in the doorway, still wearing her evening clothes from a charity function. "I couldn't sleep," she explains, then notices his experimental setup. "Please, don't let me interrupt." David hesitates, then continues his preparation. "Would you like to try something, Mrs. Emily?" The name still feels dangerous on his tongue, but her small smile encourages him. Emily settles at the kitchen island, watching him work. "Charles expects me at the Henderson's Gala next week," she says quietly. Another evening of mindless conversation and strategic socializing. Sometimes I wonder if I've become just another piece of his collected wealth. David plates the dish he's been working on, a refined take on shrimp and grits, elevated with French technique, but honoring its roots. As he sets it before Emily, he shares his own perspective. "We all wear masks, Emily. The trick is remembering your real face underneath." She takes a bite, and genuine pleasure lights up her features. "This is extraordinary, David. This is what you've been planning." When he nods, she continues, "You need to show this to people who can help make it happen." "I've been thinking about hosting a small tasting event," David admits. "Something private with potential investors. But the logistics," Emily straightens, purpose replacing her earlier melancholy. "I know exactly who to invite. Give me 2 weeks." She pauses, considering. "Charles will be in Chicago for a business conference. We'll use that time." The next few days see careful preparation hidden beneath routine. Emily makes calls from her private line, reaching out to carefully selected contacts, restaurant owners, food critics, and potential investors known for their discretion. David refines his menu, testing and adjusting each dish until it represents the perfect balance between innovation and comfort. They secure a small event space in Brooklyn, far from Charles's usual social circles. Emily handles the guest list and logistics while David focuses on the menu and presentation. Their collaboration flows naturally, each contributing their strengths to the project. One afternoon, while reviewing the plans in the kitchen, Emily shares her own dream. "I used to paint," she reveals, "before Charles. He called it a charming hobby and slowly filled my time with social obligations until my brushes dried up." She meets David's eyes. "Watching you fight for your dream reminds me of who I used to be." The weight of her words hangs between them. David understands that this event represents more than just his possible freedom. It's Emily's rebellion against the gilded cage Charles has built around her. As the day approaches, David invests his savings in professional-grade portable equipment. Each purchase feels like a step toward independence, a small victory against Charles's oppressive control. He practices his timing, his plating, his presentation, aware that this opportunity might not come again. Emily throws herself into the details, finding purpose in the planning. She selects the perfect wines to pair with David's menu, arranges for subtle but elegant decor, and crafts a guest list that balances influence with discretion. The stakes grow higher with each passing day. Both Emily and David know that discovery would mean more than just the end of their plans. It would likely result in David's immediate dismissal and stricter constraints on Emily's already limited freedom. Yet the risk feels worth it, fueled by their shared desire for autonomy and respect. The rented Brooklyn venue transforms under David's and Emily's careful planning. White tablecloths drape elegant tables, soft lighting creates an intimate atmosphere, and the kitchen gleams with borrowed professional equipment. David arrives 5 hours early, meticulously organizing his mise en place while trying to control his racing thoughts. Emily appears 2 hours before the event, having told Charles she's attending a charity committee meeting. She's chosen understated elegance, a simple black dress that won't draw attention away from David's creations. Her presence in the kitchen, helping with final preparations, speaks volumes about their evolving relationship. "The first guests will arrive in 90 minutes, she informs him, arranging hand-printed menu cards. "I've confirmed 12 attendees, including Marcus Chun from the restaurant group and Sarah Williams, the food critic." David nods, focusing on his prep work to steady his nerves. Each component of his menu represents a piece of his journey, refined comfort food that tells his story through flavor. The first course, a sophisticated take on cornbread with whipped honey butter, honors his grandmother's recipe. The main course features his signature fusion of classical French techniques with soul food influences. As guests begin to arrive, Emily smoothly steps into her role as hostess, years of social training evident in her graceful introductions. She presents David not as the Whitman's employee, but as an accomplished chef pursuing his vision. The guests, accustomed to Emily's presence at social functions, accept her endorsement without question. David's hands work steadily as he plates his first course, muscle memory taking over despite his anxiety. The kitchen's rhythm feels different from the mansion. Here, he's not a servant but an artist, each plate a canvas for his creativity. The response to his FOD exceeds expectations. Marcus Chen asks detailed questions about his business plan between courses. Sarah Williams takes notes while tasting, her usual stern expression softening with each bite. Other guests discuss potential partnerships and investment opportunities. Then Charles Whitman walks in. The room falls silent. Emily's wine glass slips from her fingers, shattering on the floor. David, emerging from the kitchen with his main course, freezes in place. Charles surveys the scene with cold calculation. "Well," he says, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "isn't this cozy? My wife and my servant, playing restaurant." Emily recovers first. "Charles, you're supposed to be in Chicago." "Clearly," he responds, moving further into the space. "I receive an interesting call from the Hendersons. Seems you've been quite busy with your project." He turns to address the assembled guests. "I apologize for this awkward situation. My employee appears to have forgotten his place." Marcus Chun stands, his business reputation making him immune to Charles's attempt at social dominance. "Actually, Mr. Whitman, we're here to evaluate a promising investment opportunity. Your employee, as you call him, has demonstrated remarkable talent and business acumen." Charles's face darkens. "Investment opportunity? This man works for me. His contract explicitly prohibits outside business ventures." "No, Charles." Emily's voice cuts through the tension. She moves to stand beside David, who still holds his carefully plated dishes. David's contract says nothing about his personal time or future endeavors. "I check personally." The gathered guests watch the drama unfold, their presence preventing Charles from his usual tactics of intimidation. David finally finds his voice. "Mr. Whitman, I've respected my duties in your home while pursuing my dream. I won't apologize for that." Emily adds, "These people are here because they recognize talent and opportunity, something you've chosen to ignore and suppress." Charles looks around the room, recognizing faces of influential people in New York's restaurant scene. His carefully constructed image of control threatens to crumble in front of precisely the type of people he needs to impress. For once, he's not the most powerful person in the room. David, seizing the moment, begins serving his main course. "Please," he addresses the guests, his voice steady, "allow me to present my interpretation of braised short ribs with a bourbon honey glaze, accompanied by truffled grits and heritage carrots." The guests turn their attention to the food, effectively dismissing Charles's presence. Emily returns to her hosting duties, leaving her husband standing alone, his authority undermined in the most polite way possible. The evening continues, with Charles retreating to a corner, watching as his wife and his employee receive compliments and business cards from New York's culinary elite. The success of the event becomes its own form of rebellion. The drive back to the mansion unfolds in Arctic silence. Charles grips the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turn white, while Emily stares straight ahead, her posture rigid. David follows in his own car, his moment of triumph now overshadowed by dread. Inside the mansion study, Charles finally erupts. "How dare you?" he snarls at Emily. "Conspiring with the help, undermining my authority, making me look like a fool in front of half of Manhattan's restaurant industry." Emily stands her ground, drawing strength from the evening's success. "Your authority? Over what, Charles? Over whom? David's talent? My independence? You can't own people's dreams. I own this house. I own the life you live." Charles sweeps his arm across his desk, sending papers and a crystal decanter crashing to the floor. Everything you have is because of me. No. Emily's voice remains steady. Everything I have is despite you. You've spent years trying to dim everyone around you to make yours. Elf Schiene brichte. But it doesn't work that way, Charles. It never did. David, hearing the confrontation from the kitchen, begins packing his essential belongings. He knows tonight marks a point of no return. The contacts he made at the tasting event offer hope for his future, but the immediate aftermath feels dangerous. Charles storms into the kitchen, his face contorted with rage. You're fired, Johnson. Get out of my house. Now! He turns to Emily, who has followed him. And you think you can humiliate me like this? Watch how quickly your social circle crumbles when they learn about your little affair with the help. Affair? Emily laughs, the sound sharp and bitter. Is that what you think this is? This is about human dignity, Charles. About recognizing talent and supporting dreams instead of crushing them under your ego. David begins to move toward the service entrance, but Emily's next words stop him. If David leaves, I leave too. Charles's face pales. You wouldn't dare. Try me, Emily challenges. I've already spoken with my lawyer. Did you forget that my family's money helped build your precious empire? I'm not as powerless as you'd like to believe. The revelation hits Charles like a physical blow. He turns to David, searching for someone he can still control. You put these ideas in her head. You turn my wife against me. No, sir, David responds calmly, finding strength in Emily's defiance. You did that yourself. I simply showed her there are better ways to treat people. Charles advances toward David, his fists clenched. You uppity, don't. Emily interrupts, stepping between them. Touch him, Charles, and I'll have security escort you out. Remember, half this house is mine. The three stand in a tableau of shifting power dynamics. Charles, his authority crumbling. Emily, standing firm in her newfound strength. And David, caught between escape and principle. David breaks the silence. I'll pack my things and go. The investors from tonight's event made some generous offers. I don't need to stay where I'm not wanted. No, Emily insists. Charles will go to the guest house tonight. We'll sort this out properly in the morning, with lawyers present if necessary. She turns to her husband. Unless you'd prefer this becomes public knowledge, I'm sure the press would love to hear about how Charles Whitman treats his household staff. Charles's face contorts with impotent rage. Years of carefully maintained control dissolve in the face of his wife's rebellion and his employees' dignity. Without another word, he storms out of the kitchen, the sound of the front door slamming echoing through the mansion. Left alone, Emily and David share a look of exhausted triumph tinged with uncertainty. They've won this battle, but the war for independence has only begun. The following days in the mansion feel like walking through a minefield. Charles moves back from the guest house, but maintains a venomous silence, his presence casting a shadow over every room he enters. He makes business calls behind closed doors, his quiet fury more threatening than his previous outbursts. Emily meets with her lawyer in the solarium, reviewing documents that detail her financial stakes in Charles's business ventures. Years of playing the perfect wife had given her intimate knowledge of his dealings, including some questionable practices she'd previously chosen to ignore. Mrs. Whitman, her lawyer explains, your family's initial investment gives you significant leverage. Additionally, the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause works both ways. I have documentation of Mr. Whitman's indiscretions. Meanwhile, David continues his duties, though the atmosphere has become nearly unbearable. He catches Charles watching him with calculated hatred, making notes in a small notebook. The other household staff avoid him, afraid of being caught in the crossfire of the brewing storm. Late one evening, Emily finds David in the kitchen organizing his recipes and contacts from the tasting event. I've made a decision, she announces, placing a thick envelope on the counter. This is for you, startup capital for your catering business. David stares at the envelope. Emily, I can't accept. You can and you will, she interrupts. It's not charity. It's an investment with proper paperwork and everything. I'm taking control of my portion of the family assets, David. This is just good business. The amount inside the envelope exceeds David's wildest expectations. Combined with his savings and the potential investors from the tasting event, it would be more than enough to launch his business properly. Charles discovers the transaction during his daily review of Emily's accounts. His reaction is swift and calculated. He calls an emergency board meeting of his company, attempting to freeze Emily's access to their joint assets. However, Emily's lawyer has already anticipated this move, filing injunctions to protect her interests. The tension reaches a breaking point when Charles confronts them in the kitchen, waving bank statements. "You think you can steal from me?" he shouts at Emily. "Everything you touch belongs to me." "No, Charles." Emily remains calm, having anticipated this confrontation. "I'm claiming what's rightfully mine. The money I gave David is from my personal inheritance, funds you never had access to." David steps forward, his voice steady. "Mr. Whitman, this is a legitimate business investment. Everything is properly documented and legal." Charles laughs bitterly. "Legal? You want to talk about legal? How about fraud? Theft? I have evidence of missing items from my house, equipment purchases made on company time." "You mean the receipts for equipment I bought with my own money?" David pulls out his meticulously kept records. "Every purchase documented, every transaction made during my off hours. I learned from watching you, sir. Documentation is everything." Emily moves closer to David, their united front further infuriating Charles. "Face it, Charles. You're not fighting against servants and submissive wives anymore. We've learned to play your game." The revelation that his victims have learned to protect themselves seems to deflate Charles temporarily. He studies them both, his tactical mind reassessing the situation. "This isn't over," he finally says. "You have no idea what you're starting." "No, Charles," Emily corrects him. "This is exactly what we're starting, independence. And there's nothing you can legally do to stop it." After Charles storms out, David turns to Emily. "We need to be careful. He won't give up control easily." Emily nods, understanding the risk they're taking. "That's why we need to move quickly. I've arranged for a meeting with potential investors tomorrow. Real ones, not just the connections from the tasting event. Are you ready?" David looks at his recipe book, at the envelope of startup capital, at the woman who has become not just an ally, but a partner in his dream of independence. "Yes," he answers. "I'm ready." In the mansion's library, Emily arranges papers across the mahogany desk, preparing for the upcoming investors' meeting. She pauses at the sound of breaking glass from Charles's study, followed by hushed phone conversations. His rage has transformed into something more dangerous, calculated determination. David spends the morning in his quarters, changing his suit for the third time. The meeting could determine not just his future, but Emily's as well. His phone buzzes with a message from Marcus Chun. "Be careful." Word is Charles has been making calls, trying to blacklist potential investors. The tension reaches new heights when Charles corners David in the hallway. "You know, Johnson," he says, his voice eerily calm, "I've been thinking about your contract, specifically the non-compete clause." David maintains his composure. "There is no non-compete clause, Mr. Whitman. We both know that." Funny thin. "G about contracts," Charles continues, straightening his tie with deliberate slowness. "They can be misremembered, especially when one party has unlimited legal resources and the other." He smirks. "Well, let's just say kitchen staff rarely win legal battles against men like me." Emily's voice cuts through the tension. "Are you threatening him, Charles?" She emerges from around the corner, her phone visible in her hand. "Because that would make an interesting addition to our legal documentation." Charles's face hardens. "You're recording me now, wife?" "Learning from the master," Emily responds coolly. "Isn't that what you taught me? Always maintain leverage." David uses the distraction to step away from Charles, moving to stand near Emily. Their united front has become automatic now, a survival instinct honed by weeks of confrontation. "The investors will be here in an hour," Emily continues. "I suggest you stay in your study, Charles, unless you want to add witness intimidation to the growing list of documented offenses." Charles's mask slips for a moment, raw fury showing through. "You think you can threaten me? In my own house?" He steps closer to Emily. "Remember who you are, dear wife. Remember what happens to people who cross me." "That's enough." David's voice is firm. Your threats don't work anymore, Mr. Whitman. Not on either of us. The three stand in charged silence, the power dynamic shifting like tectonic plates. Charles looks between them, seeing not the submissive wife and obedient servant he once controlled, but two people who have found strength in their shared resistance. Emily, David says quietly, we should prepare for the meeting. She nods, but before they can leave, Charles makes one final attempt. You know, he says, his voice dripping with insinuation. People will assume things about you too. Working so closely together, all these private meetings. Your reputations, our reputations. Emily laughs. You mean like your reputation for having affairs with junior executives? Or your reputation for racial discrimination in hiring practices? Which reputation are we discussing, Charles? The color drains from Charles's face. You wouldn't dare. Try me, Emily challenges. I've spent years collecting evidence, Charles. Insurance, I called it. Every indiscretion, every questionable business deal, every racist comment carefully documented. I learned from watching you destroy others. Always keep ammunition in reserve. David watches the exchange with a mixture of admiration and concern. Emily's transformation from submissive wife to strategic opponent is complete, but the stakes keep rising. The investors will be here soon, David reminds them both. Mr. Whitman, this can end peacefully. All we want is the freedom to pursue our own paths. Charles straightens his jacket, his businessman's mask sliding back into place. Nothing ends peacefully, Johnson. Remember that. He turns and walks away, each footstep a quiet promise of retaliation. Once he's gone, Emily's shoulders sag slightly. Are you ready for this? She asks David. No, he answers honestly. But I'm doing it anyway. The confrontation with Charles leaves both Emily and David shaken, but there's no time to dwell on his threats. The investors are due to arrive, and everything must appear perfect. David returns to the kitchen to finish preparations for the meeting's catering, while Emily makes last-minute calls to ensure their legal protection is in place. Charles watches from his study window as expensive cars begin arriving at the mansion. He recognizes several board members from his own company among them, people who should have been loyal to him. His hands shake as he pours himself a drink, spilling expensive scotch on his desk. In a moment of rare vulnerability, Charles speaks to his empty study. She was supposed to be different, he mutters, remembering when he first met Emily at a charity gala. She understood the rules, played our part perfectly, until him. The glass in his hand cracks under pressure. Meanwhile, in the mansion's formal dining room, David arranges elegant platters of canapés that showcase his fusion cuisine concept. Each piece represents hours of refinement, years of dreams. Emily enters, carrying folders of business plans and market analyses. They're all here, she informs him, including Thomas Richardson. David's hands freeze over the platter. Richardson is known for transforming promising chefs into restaurant empires. His presence could change everything. The meeting begins in the mansion's conference room, a space usually reserved for Charles's business dealings. Now it serves as the launching pad for his wife's rebellion and his employees' freedom. Emily opens the presentation with practiced grace. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss an innovative new venture in the culinary world. She nods to David, who begins serving his carefully crafted appetizers. The investor's response to the food is immediate and positive. Richardson particularly notes the sophistication of David's flavor combinations. The business presentation flows smoothly until Charles appears in the doorway. I believe, he announces, his voice carrying that dangerous calm, that you're all operating under some misconceptions. He moves into the room like a predator. My wife has been acting without proper authority, and Mr. Johnson here is in breach of his employment contract. Before panic can set in, Emily's lawyer stands. Actually, Mr. Whitman, we have documentation proving Mrs. Whitman's full legal authority to pursue this venture. As for Mr. Johnson's contract, I have it right here. There are no clauses preventing this endeavor. Charles's facade cracks. You think documents matter? You think you could just take what's mine? His voice rises with each word. I built this, all of it, and you. He turns to Emily. You think you can turn my own board members against me? Thomas Richardson clears his throat. Charles, you're embarrassing yourself. This is a legitimate business presentation, and quite frankly, the concept is brilliant. Your personal grievances have no place here. Personal grievances? Charles laughs bitterly. Do you want to know what's really going on here? My wife and my servant plotting behind my back. There's nothing legitimate about this. Emily steps forward, her voice steady. Is that what this is really about, Charles? Your hurt pride? Your need for control? Because it's not about business. Mr. Johnson's concept is solid. The market research is thorough, and the initial tasting event proved there's demand. David watches the exchange, understanding finally dawning. This isn't about money or contracts, he says quietly. This is about power. The power you're losing, Mr. Whitman. Charles turns on him with fury. You did this. You turned her against me. Everything was perfect until I started seeing people as human beings. Emily interrupts. Until I remembered who I was before you tried to turn me into another possession. The investors watch this display with growing discomfort and understanding. They see not the polished Charles Whitman they know from board meetings, but a man unraveling as his control slips away. Charles, Richardson says firmly, I suggest you step out and let us continue this meeting professionally. Unless you'd prefer this scene to become common knowledge in our circles. The investment meeting concludes successfully despite Charles's interruption, but his parting glare promises further conflict. As the last investors leave, Emily suddenly feels lightheaded and steadies herself against the conference room table. David moves to help her, concern evident on his face. Emily, are you all right? She takes a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. I need to tell you something, David. Both of you. She looks toward Charles, who lingers in the doorway. I'm Nant. The silence that follows feels like a physical weight. Charles steps forward, a triumphant smile beginning to form until Emily continues. It's not yours, Charles. The color drains from Charles's face. What did you say? Remember that charity gala in Boston 3 months ago? The one you were too busy to attend? Emily's voice remains steady. I wasn't alone that weekend. David stands frozen, processing the implications. The timing coincides with his own brief trip to Boston, where Emily had encouraged him to meet with a restaurant consultant. That weekend had changed everything between them, though they'd never spoken of it since. Charles lunges forward, his carefully maintained facade shattering completely. You whore! With him! He gestures wildly at David. My servant! No, Charles. Emily's voice cuts like steel. With a man who sees me as a person, not a possession. A man who has more dignity working as your servant than you've shown as my husband. David finds his voice. Mr. Whitman, whatever happens next needs to happen civilly. For everyone's sake. Charles laughs maniacally. Civilly? You want civility after destroying my marriage, my reputation? He turns to Emily. You think you can just announce this and walk away? With my money? My connections? Your money? Emily raises an eyebrow. My family's investment built half your empire, Charles. As for connections, she removes a flash drive from her pocket. Every questionable deal, every racist comment, every affair, it's all here. Dating back years, I learned to keep records, just like you taught me. The implications hit Charles like a physical blow. His business empire, built on carefully maintained appearances, could crumble if certain information became public. The pregnancy announcement isn't just a personal betrayal. It's the final piece in Emily's carefully constructed escape plan. David moves closer to Emily, his presence both protective and supportive. This doesn't have to become a public scandal, Mr. Whitman. We can handle this privately, with dignity. Dignity? Charles spits the word. You talk about dignity while standing there with my pregnant wife. Ex-wife soon enough, Emily corrects. The papers are already drawn up. You can fight it, Charles, but think carefully about what that fight will cost you. Not just money, everything you've built. The three stand in a triangle of shifting power, each understanding that this moment changes everything. Charles sees his carefully constructed world crumbling. Emily feels the weight of her freedom within reach, and David realizes that his dreams of independence now carry far more responsibility than he'd imagined. Finally, Charles speaks, his voice hollow. "You planned this. All of it. The business, the investors, the pregnancy announcement. You orchestrated my humiliation." "No, Charles," Emily responds softly. "You did that yourself. We just decided to stop playing by your rules." David steps forward. "Mr. Whitman, we can work out a reasonable arrangement. One that preserves everyone's dignity and future." Charles looks between them, his wife carrying another man's child, his servant now standing as an equal. The final vestiges of his control dissolve. Without another word, he turns and walks out of the conference room, leaving Emily and David to face their uncertain but shared future together. The story ends not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet victory of dignity over power, of love over control, of dreams over fear. In the mansion's growing darkness, Emily and David stand together, their hands clasped, ready to face whatever comes next.